realized, because we were losing so many people, with injection drug users being a large part of that population, we had to regroup and reframe about what we thought about drugs, and particularly around opiates and injection drug use. And so many things that he said was like a punch in the belly to me, because I work with active drug users and have done for the past 30 years, and they are wonderful people, and they are your mother, your brother, your sister, your child, your neighbor, your school teacher, your nurse, your doctor. There's nothing about injection drug use that makes somebody a bad person, that makes somebody's life not worthy or worth living. So let's sort of regroup around that and what we've heard thus far, and recognize that that was before we had a new language around drug use. So in my bio it said that I'm a harm reduction activist. I'm one of the OGs in terms of the harm reduction movement, and it was a social movement, and it allowed us to rethink about drug use and drug users. It allowed us to sort of analyze critically the war on drugs and what that has done to our communities, particularly around disenfranchised populations, communities of color, people that were outside, and no longer have that sort of attitude about good drugs and bad drugs, right? So, you know, when I first learned harm reduction, the teachers would come in the room, or mentors, and would say, how many people used a drug today? And if you think about it, really everybody raised their hand, because we all had our morning cup of coffee, or we all had our cigarette outside, or we all had our antidepressant in the morning. These are all drugs. A drug is simply something that changes your state of mind, right? A mood-altering substance. So yes, alcohol, cocaine, heroin, antidepressants, cigarettes, coffee, tea, all of these are mood-altering substances. So let's regroup around that and not have the good drugs and the bad drugs. You know, the acid was a good drug, the heroin was a bad drug. Marijuana now is legal the same way that the 5 martini lunch that all the Richies on Madison Avenue had, right? So we have to like reframe what we think about drugs. So I'm here as a representative of the REACH Clinic. I am, a bunch of my colleagues are here in the audience as well. Giorgio is the social worker that I work with. One of our docs is in the audience, our other social workers in the audience, patient navigator, and the director of our clinic. If you want to, you can raise your hands, you don't have to. And we brought a bunch of drug information with us, which is on the table over there, and we brought Narcan kits with us. So Narcan, also known as naloxone, is what can reverse an opiate overdose. And we're happy to train folks here and have you take away with you a couple of Narcan kits so you too can be a good neighbor and help the person at the bus stop, or the person down the hall, or your brother that's in the room next to you, or your son, or your mother, or your father, and so forth. Because that's who drug users are. They're all of us. So I just had to say that because I was so verklempt, if people know what that means, by that 1982 poem. So my role at the REACH Clinic is as the buprenorphine nurse care manager. Do folks know what buprenorphine is? If you do, also known as Suboxone. So Suboxone is only the second drug that the United States has legalized to treat what we call opiate use disorder. Do folks know what the first drug was? Methadone, exactly. So methadone was, I believe it was rolled out as a treatment for opiate use disorder in the 50s, if I'm correct. And it came with a lot of restrictions because of how we thought about drug users, right? So folks that are on methadone typically call it the velvet handcuffs. And there's a great documentary film actually about the velvet handcuffs, which is a global view of methadone, and the US folks are from right here in East Harlem that have were participants in methadone programs up here. So it's a great documentary if you get to see it.
What is it called then?
It's called the velvet handcuffs. Liquid handcuffs. So liquid handcuffs, thank you. So the reason methadone is sometimes referred to as liquid handcuffs is because it's so tightly regulated. Most folks have to go to the clinic every single day to get, quote, medicated. So it's all about power and control, if you ask me, but I'm on the radical fringe. But you know, there are reasons why folks need to kind of check in and make sure somebody's safe and, you know, make sure you're taking your medicine and so forth. But every day is a little bit of, you know, excessive, and it has to do with feeling like folks that were back in the day when it was offered as a treatment, feeling that folks that were once addicted, always addicted, you know, and not able to live a full bona fide life, having to be like under the microscope at all times. Fast forward, about 15 years ago, Suboxone, buprenorphine, I'm going to say Bupe to make it easy. Suboxone is the name brand, so it's like saying Kleenex instead of tissues. So I'm going to call it buprenorphine as a mouthful. But about 15 years ago, buprenorphine came out as another alternative for opiate dependence, and it had very different regulations, very, very different. In that, number one, it could be ordered at a doctor's office by your primary care doctor, similar to your blood pressure medicine or your diabetes medicine and so forth. So it was no longer stigmatizing or pathologizing in such a deep way the person that had an opiate dependence. And it could also be ordered by a psychiatrist, and of course it could also be ordered at what we call OTPs, or opiate treatment programs, which are places, methadone programs are considered OTPs. So that was a huge freedom for folks to deal with their opiate dependence in a whole nother dignified way. And also to be able to be discreet about it, to not have to wait on a line outside. I don't know if folks have ever walked by 125th Street on a cold, rainy morning and seen lines of people waiting to get into the clinic. You no longer had to deal with that horrific stigma. The issue, though, is that it was kind of only people in the know, or that had sort of Cadillac insurance, or, you know, and often these were privileged folks, often these were white folks, or folks that, you know, wouldn't typically get considered as a, quote, drug user, the bad drug user. And it took quite a while for it to get picked up by insurance companies and for it to have a broader access to more of the community at large. But about maybe 6 or 7 years ago, the New York City Department of Health started to fund programs. 4 years ago, the REACH Clinic was funded to offer this model where there was sort of a nurse and extra support for folks so that they could get buprenorphine treatment in primary care, which is what we do. So the same way somebody would come to our clinic and we would treat their diabetes or their high blood pressure, we will now also treat their opiate use disorder. One of the big barriers was that doctors were not wanting to prescribe this. I don't want my waiting room full of those people. So a lot of our support that the nurse offers and that the Department of Health offers is actually support for providers to make it easier for them to prescribe, to offer extra support services for the patients, because often folks that are struggling with addiction do have a lot of other issues in their life. They might be unstably housed, they might have untreated mental illness, they might need support around a plethora of things. So having these sort of programs that offer extra support with a nurse and with social workers and patient navigators, we're able to support both the patient and the providers, the doctors and the nurse practitioners that prescribe the medication.
How long has your program been in existence?
Our program, particularly at REACH, has been funded for, I think, about 4 or 5 years. Prior to REACH doing this buprenorphine focus, it was a hepatitis C clinic. So we were already working with folks that had hepatitis C, many of whom were drug users. And so it was a sort of drug and alcohol focus with opiate use disorder. Now, just because you use opiates now and then doesn't mean you have an opiate use disorder. And one thing that I'm always talking with my patients about is the difference between addiction and dependence. And I think that's really important for folks to recognize. You know, you might be dependent on your insulin. You're not addicted to your insulin. And, you know, people use drugs. My colleague said people use drugs throughout time. Human beings have always used drugs. We use drugs because they feel good. And, you know, a lot of times we don't want to recognize how good they feel. When I talk to folks that are using like heroin or cocaine, it's like heroin is the bliss drug. Opiates are the bliss drug. Cocaine is the power drug. Cocaine and speed are the power drugs. Some people want a little bit of both, and that's where you get your speedball. But you know, and then psychedelics are a whole nother. Those are sort of mind-expanding drugs, you know, and you know, sort of maybe trying to have a connection with spirit. You know, I think that's one of the reasons why the psychedelic renaissance is so huge right now, is people looking for sort of deeper connection. But you know, we don't want to throw out the fact that people use drugs. They use drugs because they feel good, and sometimes that ends up turning into a real problem for folks. And that's what opiate use disorder is. It's when you're doing things that no longer serve you in order to have the drugs. So, you know, we need to have a little bit of a critical analysis around drugs in general, around drug use, around its intersections with social justice, and then of course have tools that can support folks when they are struggling.
Sure. Thanks, Stacey. I guess I just like how I'm here is I am friends with an artist, Jesse, about an art piece in the art show, and I went to it, and I also was a social worker at the hospital, and I also used to do heroin and was on buprenorphine, so I'm here for a lot of reasons. And I'm honored to be here, and I also feel like I learned a lot from everyone here. I'm honored to be in this sacred space, and to hear the beautiful music and the words. And when I was listening to some of the music, the first part, I was just kind of like struck by the kind of grief that's part of all of this conversation. So I'm kind of just saying that, and the beauty that's part of this conversation, and how it's really full dimensional. And then when the percussion came out, I was also just like in reverence of the space, and of learning and being curious, and of the beautiful music. And, you know, kind of lucky to feel alive and here learning continuously. I feel like what your question about who does this affect, or my mind's kind of spinning, so it's like I almost heard pandemic, but it was the opioid crisis. But it's also those things have morphed on top of each other, and it affects everyone, and I think it disproportionately affects communities of color, and it certainly disproportionately, you know, the effects of the negative impacts of opiates definitely has to do with class, and also the interventions, some of those that Stacey's talking about, that have been developed and over many, many movements have been interrupted too, and more even fragmented by the pandemic. So I think connection that can be so healing, and even I'm so happy to be here right now because I feel like I'm being very much sustained by this, by feeling and sensing different perspectives and ways of being about this topic, that's been cut off, but also more some of the access to connection, like for a lot of people experiencing substance use lifestyle, whether that's, you know, I had a response to that video. I felt like it was an ununderstanding friend of somebody who was using substances, who wasn't understanding that maybe someone would go to substances. They were kind of critiquing the coolness factor, but sometimes I think even from that point of view, it's like the people who connect with drug life might be sometimes there's something to fill, like there's for whatever reason some attachment that's lacking. There's something, and drugs have created an access to feelings that people, because of trauma might not be able to access with relationships, let's just say. So Harlem makes you feel really warm and loved, and if you don't feel loved, you know, that's a good place to feel it. If, you know, who's to say it's good or bad, but it's a place to feel it. And, you know, so I think that's those kind of biopsychosocial issues, but like that relational issues and trauma can add to why people use. But in terms of, I think so many people are affecting a lot of people's lifelines to groups and things that connect people have been fragmented by COVID. So it feels like it's, people are suffering more. And one thing that I do at Reach that I love as part of my work there is I facilitate a community-based group that used to be in person, and we'd have like 20 people there. And it was really amazing, and people talk to each other, and I'm sort of just like, welcome, do a little meditation. Everyone talks, and there's grandmas, and people are bonding, and I don't even know what they're talking about, and it's really good. And it was a community. And we're not allowed to have that in person anymore because of the pandemic, so it's virtual. And just that, it's like another barrier, right? And so we did lose several group members, and it's not to say because they could no longer come to group that they died, but the lack of connection, the disconnection of this time, I think is even more difficult for people in trying to get treatment for their substance use issues. So I just wanted to say that, and that's who it affects. To answer your question.
I think the first I was asked to speak today about drugs and art. You know, I was in the mid-80s. I was a business consultant. I was in Japan. Then I met Haruko Minakami. She is the chief editor of Music Magazine, who used to connect with Beatles and so on. And then she invited Lydia Lunch. You know, she's a poetry reading artist and also connecting with Jim Peters. You know, that this is the kind of the middle 80s, and everyone taking drugs. And then she came to Japan, and then I was helping the concert of Lydia Lunch. And then she came, and then together at the time, Richard Kahn, who was at the time underground filmmaker, Lower East Side in New York. And he was together with Lydia Lunch, and we get along, and then I start promoting Richard Kahn film, which is also connecting with the drug culture and also the Lower East Side. He was actually, at the time, he was selling the drugs every month, because that's only the income. And then this is the way I stepped into, and then I came to New York 1985. And then I met, Soru, who is a famous author for filmmaking, Hollywood films and so on. And then meeting many friends through, the kind of drug community with art. It was, people taking speed or, heroin and, different cloud and so on. At the time, so then I met Richard Hamilton. So Richard Hamilton was one of the, famous artists at the time, same as Basquiat, and also what is his name, Keith Haring, and then Richard Hamilton. They are the triangulations because they are taking the heroin, and they don't have money. Then they exchange the art for buying the heroin. So the Richard and I became very close friends. So I used to visit him time to time, and then then there's a what is the name, Basquiat friends who are Broadway singer. She was also there. So many people are taking heroin and taking, there's a little bit, very depressive at the same time. So that's a way I connected with, this drug and art very much deeply into the culture of New York at the time. And then that was one of the connections for me, before becoming an artist, I became an artist in 1988. So beforehand, I was connecting or interacting with these people, and there are. I don't really attach to drugs myself, but at the same time, all the people surrounding me are very much into this. Also the drug culture create a lot of creative method of the conceptual art. Also, this no one talk about it anymore, but also the paintings or many way of looking at the world. I don't say it's positive and negative, but this is a phenomenon, and also, but also that I was, today I want to speak a little bit about the MK Ultra project, which was created by CIA, and also the military complex making the human many creations. And then music was a very important part of the MK Ultra project, connecting with the war in Vietnam between 1965 to 1973. And the extension of this influence of the drug culture came to the art. And this art is very much observed from this aspect of the government, also the planning, how human can be controlled, and that was one of the other topic I want to discuss today. But anyway,
Do you think art gives people a license to experiment with drugs?
some the CIA was trying to generate money using art, and they were not. Also, the time of war in Vietnam, I used to go to Thailand a lot. So Thailand was a very important place for the Golden Triangle. And the northern Thailand to Myanmar, they have a huge opium, productions. And it was a part of the way that CIA used for generating their activities money, but they used New York as one of also the consumption place to generate money. And that's also the art was overlapped with this, after the war in Vietnam, continuously moving this, golden triangle production of the opium coming to the United States. But anyway, this is a little bit far topic, but I think, I'm Japanese, so I still Thailand. I went to the Golden Triangle myself. So that there are so many consumption, and they have, of course, there are a lot of, operations, by the CIA and military complex working in it. So this, of course, this is also connected with this culture in the 80s, and also the time into the time of AIDS. So, some of my friends passed away with AIDS, or some people I knew they got AIDS and so on. So at the time, so the people are living also the fear because of the AIDS infection was very much in the part of the culture too, in the same time. So of course, this is all interactive, also the connected government operations also included. But not so many people talk about this point of this, art and drug issue. Same as like Mexico, there's so much drug traffic, and that's connecting the weapon deal with the Pentagon selling the weapons to Mexican, mafias. I used to go to El Paso many times, so I met so many people connecting with sort of drug transactions or human trafficking and so on. So I went to so many times. Juarez is one of the worst places in the world for the mass murders with heavy weapons, which are supposed to use for the war in Iraq or some other countries. But anyway, that's another topic. But I want to combine this part of the topic into the art, a larger view. Because many of my friends engage into the drug, issues, and then some of them passed away. So, I want to, it is a great opportunity to talk about it. Also the point from the humanitarian point of view, also the cultural point of view, also the creative point of view.
If I could try to somehow encapsulate these two sort of parallel discussions here going on. My colleagues to the left are talking about how we need to sort of change the nomenclature about drug addiction because of its stigmatization. That's absolutely correct. And that yes, people are going to take drugs, and so then what is the context for their consumption? We could go on a sort of stereotype, they've had broken homes and et cetera, social, emotional problems. That's true, but you also have individuals that, and here I'm going to use the so-called psychedelic renaissance, that are interested in these substances for epistemological reasons. That is to say, to try to explore aspects of their own sense of who they are and their placement within the world. So in one sense, neither of these manifestations of drug usage is neither less noble or more than the other. But I think what's very important is to maybe look at how other countries have approached this in terms of decriminalization, and that drug usage should not be deemed a criminal problem, but actually a policy problem that's based on issues of health and as well as social backdrops, or whatever it might be. If somebody needs help by their own volition, or somebody wants to consume psychedelics or whatever it might be, there should be an aspect of decriminalization. So there's certainly that part. And then what Naritoshi is talking about is sort of the political backdrop of what we were talking about. For example, Purdue Pharma was fined about $8.3 billion, and they admitted that one of their intentions was to find doctors that they could funnel their drugs through to try to make as much money as possible. And none of the CEOs went to jail, but the prison industrial complex is full of people of color who are incarcerated for extremely small amounts of drugs. So there's that political dynamic that's involved here that reaches many different levels, from, let's say, not enough funding that the government might give because it's busy giving tax breaks to the wealthy, and so there's not enough access for people to use the social services that they need, on the one hand, or are we talking about sort of the international circuit? For example, I'm reminded of a work by Mona Said Kamal, one of the artists in the exhibition, and she made this carpet in which she wove in the numbers of people who have been killed by drone attacks in Afghanistan. And we know certainly that that war, even though it presents itself as a political or an exportation of democracy and so forth, and it's also tied in with opium trafficking, among other things. The same thing can be said of what Noritoshi said about drug cartels. These things don't happen in a vacuum, whether it's like the corruption south of the border or the consumption north of the border. These things is a very multifaceted international problem that I think takes a lot of thinking, and certainly I think foundational is to fundamentally sort of change the nomenclature on a local level, because as my colleague Stacy said, these people who are stricken for drug consumption, however we want to term it, it's not like that person over there. It's like family members. It's like people that we know. And so we need to humanize the situation that we find ourselves in. Is there any questions out there that you would like to ask any of the panelists? Or maybe you could dovetail on what I just mentioned.
Can we poll the audience as to how many people are using drugs?
I'm sorry?
Can we poll the audience as to how many people are using drugs?
We used a drug today.
Coffee?
You don't have to disclose which drug.
Yes. Then I'm guilty.
But I can say something about
Of
what you
course.
just said. You had asked earlier what, if we saw things worse, or so, I don't know how to paraphrase, but you were like, have we seen an increase in the opiate dependence? I think that's one of the first questions you were asking. One of the things we have seen an increase in, of course, as we know, is overdoses. And that is, in fact, driven by the drug supply. What you're talking about, too, is because all the drug supply is now cut with fentanyl, which is a synthetic opiate, which is either 10 to 100 times as strong as, old school heroin, right? And that's particularly because of trade routes and money and it can be made in a laboratory, and the supply, the block of 1 pound can become a block of 10 pounds. And that's, in the bag that the person gets, it's an unknown quantity of how strong that opiate is. So that's why there's this huge rash of accidental overdose deaths right now, and it has all to do with this whole sort of international supply, and we don't even call it adulteration anymore. 2 years ago when I was talking about fentanyl, I would tell folks, your bag is contaminated with fentanyl. Now we just say, as you know, the bag contains fentanyl, because most of the drugs on the street, of the heroin, for instance, is in fact fentanyl. And folks are buying fentanyl even on purpose, or seeking the fentanyl rather than something else. But the issue is it's an unknown quantity because it's, bootleg, basically. Even though it's all bootleg, now it's sort of double bootleg.
Yes. Can I comment?
Of course.
The Chinese are behind it.
Well, we never want to, the Chinese were behind COVID too, right? So you never want to point your finger at a country or that's,
No.
is it useful?
There's something behind it, and it's a possibility. The way that Syria is just the biggest exporter of amphetamines right now. 10 years after the war is not ended, has become the biggest factory of amphetamines, and they make billions of dollars. But it was a very touchy fact that it's political, it's economic, and also maybe they're trying to see the youth that here. Just something that came to my mind that this news to read and try to elaborate between it's true or half true, etc. Right?
Yeah, I think I just like wearing to putting a pinpoint on it, and I don't know, but there is like a lot of scapegoating China for different things going on now. Yeah. But I could just say maybe one thing about like treatment and sure, thanks. Well, one thing too is that for the overdoses, there's the overdose reversal, which is in the Narcan kits over there, that we can share. Anyone can have one and bring it home, and that's a very easy, effective way to reverse an overdose on opiates, from opiates, and it really works fabulously. So that's a great thing. Another really cool historic thing is that supervised injection sites are open and legal in New York City now. One on 126th Street, right here. So that's fabulous, and it's for safer injecting, smoking, sniffing, and so you can kind of go use there and get support to have it be less harmful. And then I just wanted to talk for a second about how a lot of people sometimes who are even in recovery who have chosen not to use substances but maybe did before, sometimes as in opposition with abstinence, and it's totally not. Abstinence and the recovery disease model and harm reduction can work beautifully together. Harm reduction can be its own end, and it respects the autonomy and self-determination of people to be in recovery if they choose to be so. The thing, though, that isn't so, it isn't necessarily equal the other way around. So if one is sort of imposing abstinence on others as a treatment requirement, that makes no sense, because it's not sort of respecting the self-determination of the person, and oftentimes, it comes through in a court-mandated way that's very racialized and problematic, and not acknowledging any of that, and then just pretending that, oh, it's abstinence for substance use, without acknowledging that the law enforcement is completely different for white people and people of color, and that, so that if people are being mandated to treatment and it's abstinence-based, that doesn't make sense. But if people have access to and are choosing treatment, and they choose abstinence-based treatment for themselves, whoever they are, that makes sense. And that is part of harm reduction because it's part of self-determination. So it's not like one or the other, but it's a little nuance with that, I think. That's,
What would you say about, just to take the sort of devil's advocate here from like the other side of the aisle, if you will, that sees that this type of social services could lead to further addiction, and that addiction, quote unquote, leads to crime, and crime needs to end, and people need to be incarcerated. You're shocked that I'm even saying it.
Well, where's the question?
Yes.
What's
The question is that you mentioned the injection centers, which is fantastic because this is a place that people would feel safe. But what I'm saying is that from the other side, they would say, well, that this kind of promotes consumption because of its sort of libertine aspect to it. In other words, these individuals should be incarcerated for their crimes, if you will. That's what I was getting at earlier about decriminalization. It's very important to decriminalize, not in the sense that it's going to create a society that's rampant or what have you. I mean, these are some of the fears that, for anxieties, that 70 million fellow Americans voted for, and I don't need to say what or who. Do you understand what I'm getting at?
Yeah, I mean, I think, there are punitive drug laws, and that's why we know, like, the war on drugs has failed, right? And I think everybody's acknowledged that, and then monies instead need to go into supporting folks that are struggling. One thing I think that's really interesting is that, 5 years ago we called them safer injection sites, and when they became legal here in New York, they're called overdose prevention sites, because that's in fact what they are. They're overdose prevention sites. And the first week they saved 17 fatal overdoses here on 126th Street, the first week. So, I mean, so if we can talk about the perfect world that we want. We want the world where people aren't feeling like in order to survive they have to use a substance, but that's not the world we have. So the same way that 100 years ago, maybe a little more, it was a crime to be poor, and there were places called poorhouses, which were basically prisons. Ward's Island was a poorhouse, and if you couldn't pay your bills, whatever those tiny little bills were, you were sent away. It was a crime to be poor. And society has moved away from that. We know that that's, not criminalized, right? And so hopefully people that are struggling with addiction will eventually also not be criminalized, because it's not a criminal issue. But America as we have it now, was started by Puritans, and these are the vestiges of the puritanical lens that America does its policy and policing around.
All right. Any other questions from the audience? Comments or anything you'd like to share with any of our panelists about this evening? Where did our organizer go to? Noetoshi?
Exactly. I think one of the, is it working? Yes. So one of the things about, all this drug production and development, also connecting with U.S. Army Biological Laboratories, they are engaged not only China, all these issues that the global, like unification of the strategies that they created together. That's what I believe. But anyway, one of the things I want to tell you is that I just wanted to speak about Japan. So before the Second World War, Japanese culture had been developing like over 3,000 years, connecting with what we call marijuana and so on. So this is a very important culture for Japan for over 2000, and they're using this for the overculture, spiritual, also the religious, reason. Also they're using for treatment many parts. So the drug is a very big part of Japanese culture. Then when Japan becomes surrendered under U.S. occupation, like the GHQ, and then Japanese culture of the marijuana or this, what do you call it? What's the name of the plants? Hemp, yes. So hemp is a very big part of Japanese culture for 1,000 years. Then U.S. government restricted not to use hemp completely. So then what happened was then there was an order come from the big company, what's the name? I just wrote it, DuPont. So DuPont company are not allowed to use hemp because hemp was also using for the rope, many purposes. So that then since then the Japanese culture has been distorted so much, not only for the restrictions, but also the culture, also the ceremonies, or the Shinto, like shrines, festival, every direction distortion to happen. And they still keep running this for nearly 80 years. And then now, finally, 8 years after, the Japanese are really hoping to bring back this hemp culture. Because hemp culture is the core of the Japanese tradition, also creation, and many aspiration, also the inspiration, all the aspects they have. So I don't say that all the drug issues is a negative effect, but also they're very important core of human existence are also connected. So that the restriction or punishment concept doesn't work, because that's also the long-term human nature, culture are combined with the drugs.
Yes, definitely, I agree with you, and I think our other two colleagues would agree with you as well. How some cultures have a historical link, in this case, hemp, or it might be the Native American church, et cetera, et cetera. There's many instances in which cultures have this connection, which, again, sort of cuts against the grain of the sort of status quo and how they try to control behaviors, so to speak. If there's no questions from the audience, then I guess we should wrap things up. I'd like to thank Stacy, Giorgio as well, for all the work that they continue to do. It's fantastic. And Kochi here for what he's been doing in his activism and the foundation that he's involved in as well, working with artists and curators, but within the context of providing social services.
Can I speak one thing what I'm doing right now? So anyway, after the COVID-19 pandemic, I used to help the children in Fukushima who are suffering with all the radiation and so on. And then so many children are heavily radiated. Now 60% of the entire maybe children in Fukushima are brain damage. No news comes up, even the US broadcasting all cover up because of the Fukushima Daiichi was created by the General Electric created. So they don't want people to know what's going on. The radiation contamination is extremely bad, and it's more, maybe 4 to 5 times of Chernobyl disasters, radiation coming out. But now, because of pandemic restrictions, create impossible to make any treatment. But we have been making a treatment for the therapy. So then I changed using this method of experiments of treating trauma, children with trauma. I decided to promote the children who are suffered under the COVID-19 pandemic restrictions, because 70% of the world people, children, out of 700 million out of 1 billion children are under depression right now. And no one doing anything. I contact the government organization, different international organization, blah, blah, blah. No one cares. Because they don't have much of the extension of doing something for humanitarian. So then I started thinking maybe the good way to use art therapy is application, so everyone can get the application of the download application to make art therapy treatment, because of the human interaction was very limited somewhere, because of the government our restriction created is impossible. So I started making the children, saving children, not children to be forgotten, because many doctors now prescribing antidepressant, and antidepressant create more suicide. So every week, over 400 children commit suicide on this product. And then many doctors, for the sake of money, they are giving the prescription of the antidepressant, which create more suicide. So to stop this, the art therapy is much more effective, and there's no side effect, and there's no, there's a lot of potential. So I'm working on right now for doing this, because of this is a great opportunity to know how the therapy can be effective without human interactions. This is a very challenging thing, but I'm working on this now and communicating with several.
Is there a website people can?
There is. I can send the email. There's also the Facebook page. Today's the Foundation. You go there. They have some update, because we're working on the museum SMAC. It's the most important museum in Belgium. Philip Cochran, who is a sociologist, actually become a museum director, and he's also associated with many medical help, or many cancer patients and so on. So we're become partners, and also we become partners of the National Gallery Singapore and connecting with National University Hospital and the Art Therapy Division. So we're working on that. If you can check today's the foundation, you can see the update.
Okay.
Thank you.
WhiteBox will put on their website, and also the massive I would like to say that the exhibition is extended through January 6th. Epiphany, very important actually in this particular area of the city, as Latinx people, right? And we find another panel to close the exhibition, and perhaps there we will have Alan, who just left from the cultural project, would like to participate. And we have two people who are going to come here, but there was a little conflict of interest. So the next one will most likely kind of concentrate on the good psychotropic drugs that have helped humanity. Today they're being used to help depression, etc. Right?
PTSD too.
PTSD.
They found out that microdosing of MDMA has actually helped increasingly much to Iraqi veterans who suffer from PTSD, among other things. So, things look really fantastic. But then, of course, there's like the elephant in the room, which is like, people, we can't like dehumanize them because of what they do. And it just needs to be a much more humane approach to the challenges that we face collectively.
Yeah, and also finish that by saying that I agree with Rudoshi, that really art therapy and art really is one of the best therapies to cure anything. Insomnia, lack of sex, everything.
Yes, I just wanted to put something out in the universe, which was maybe further collaboration around art therapy practices with everyone here.
Very good.
Take you along.
Well, then I thank you so much. And thank you above all to the Jewish Church.
Yes.
Thank you so
They're
much.
a fantastic thing. Come on, and support them, please. Got it? Yes.